It's fascinating, isn't it, how Harry Potter just keeps going?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, even with things like the stage play, which felt a bit different maybe, and some of the later movies didn't quite hit like the early ones,
Yeah, yeah.
but the franchise is still huge, book sales are strong. That Hogwarts Legacy game was a monster success.
Massive.
And the Wizarding World parks, always packed. People are just completely drawn in.
It makes you wonder what the secret sauce is, right?
Exactly. And I think, a huge part has got to be that incredibly detailed world, the lore. Fans just can't get enough of it.
You've hit on something really key there. It's that desire for authenticity that seems to drive so much of the fandom.
Right.
So when the news broke about the HBO series, the promise of a really faithful adaptation of the books, well, the excitement was just huge.
Oh, definitely. The idea of really digging into the novels on screen, letting all those details breathe, it felt like, wow, this could be amazing.
Huge potential. But as often happens, one piece of casting news seems to have really stirred things up.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. The talk around Papa Essiedu, a black actor, potentially playing Severus Snape, it sparked a pretty intense debate online.
It really has.
And that's actually the core of our deep dive today. We got some commentary from a listener focusing right on these reactions, these arguments.
Okay.
So let's get into it. What was the immediate vibe, according to this source?
Well, the source really doesn't pull any punches. It starts right off asking, are we still doing this?
Like deja vu.
Exactly. A sense that these casting debates are just happening again and again with adaptations. And it's interesting, the source immediately contrasts this Snape reaction with the apparently positive buzz around Janet McTeer maybe playing McGonagall.
Oh, right.
Yeah, mentioning specifically that people thought she looked the part. It kind of suggests that visual similarity is, well, a big deal for some fans.
That visual link, yeah, seems important. But then the source really draws a line in the sand, stating flat out, Snape is white.
Wow, okay, direct.
Very. And there's this feeling in the commentary, almost bracing for impact, expecting to be called racist just for pointing out what's described in the text. It sets a pretty charged tone.
It certainly does. And the main argument against this casting, as the source lays it out, keeps coming back to that promise, that faithful adaptation promise.
Right, the core promise of the series.
Yeah. So the idea of a black Snape is immediately positioned as, like, breaking that promise. The source uses strong words, calls it a lie, and even gaslighting casting.
Gaslighting casting, that's quite a phrase.
It is. It really makes you think about what faithful actually means to different people. Is it the plot, character arcs, or does it have to include physical descriptions?
And this is where the source introduces that concept. They call it identity over authenticity. They bring up the comparison to the Black Hermione and the stage play Cursed Child, which also, got people talking.
A lot of talk, yeah.
But then they make this comparison to Amazon's The Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power. And this seems to be a key example for them.
Absolutely. The source is pretty blunt about it. Calls Rings of Power a flop.
Wow.
And presents it as basically Exhibit A for what happens when, in their view, identity gets prioritized over sticking to the established lore, like a warning sign.
Cautionary tale, yeah. But it does make you wonder, is calling it a flop entirely fair? And can you really pin its reception, whatever it was, just on casting?
That's a really good question. The source also pushes back against the idea that Harry Potter itself isn't diverse.
Oh, interesting. How so?
They list several non-white characters straight from the books. Dean Thomas, Lee Jordan, the Patil twins, Cho Chang, Kingsley Shacklebolt.
Right, Kingsley, who becomes Minister of Magic eventually.
Exactly. And the source even suggests, hey, maybe Papa Essiedu would have been a fantastic Kingsley.
So the argument is that there were already opportunities for diversity within the existing roles.
That seems to be the point. Why change a character like Snape, whose appearance is described, when there are other established roles? The source frames the Snape casting as feeling like, quote, the same old, same old.
Same old, same old.
Yeah, and they even compare it to the criticism around the marketing for the 2016 Ghostbusters movie. The implication being that maybe it's about generating controversy on purpose.
Ah, the controversy creates trends idea.
Yeah.
Does the source think that strategy actually works?
Well, they seem skeptical. They point to The Acolyte as a more recent show, suggesting that maybe stirring the pot with casting doesn't always guarantee success.
Okay.
And then they list a whole bunch of other big franchises. Disney Star Wars, Star Trek, the MCU, Rings of Power again. Doctor Who. They even just say hell Hollywood generally.
So basically saying this approach has a questionable track record across the board, according to them.
That's the argument presented, yeah. That maybe the risk of alienating the existing fan base isn't worth whatever buzz you generate with these kinds of choices.
It definitely taps into a feeling some people have that studios are prioritizing certain things over maybe fan expectations or source material.
Right. And that brings us to one of the most common responses you hear in these debates. But the book doesn't explicitly say he's white. How does the source handle that specific point?
They tackle it head on. And they come armed with textual evidence, quite a bit of it, actually.
Okay, like what?
The source pulls out direct quotes from the books describing Snape. Things like, Snape's sallow skin had gone the color of sour milk.
Sour milk, wow, okay.
Another one. He looked slightly paler than usual. Then, Snape looked paler than usual and angrier. Also, looking into Snape's pale face.
Paler, pale face. Seems consistent.
And maybe the most vivid one, Snape's face was like a death mask. It was marble white.
Marble white, that's pretty specific.
Yeah, it's a fair amount of description, all pointing towards, well, a very pale complexion.
That much textual detail does make the ambiguous race argument harder to sustain, doesn't it?
It seems to, based on this evidence. And the source adds another layer. They mention JK Rowling's own drawing of Snape.
Oh, she drew him?
Apparently so, and she reportedly described it as Snape as I always saw him, which adds that element of, authorial intent.
Right, so the text describes him as pale, and the author's own vision seems to match that. That's the argument.
Precisely. Now, whenever casting changes like this happen, you inevitably get the comparisons, the whataboutism, as some call it.
Ah, yes. What about this other character?
Exactly. And the source actually goes through a few examples, giving their take on whether those race swaps worked or not.
Okay, interesting. What examples do they use? Well, they mentioned Corlys Velaryon in House of the Dragon. The source says that one basically worked, though they do point out he's a pretty important character.
Okay, so importance matters.
Seems to be a factor in their analysis. Then there's Jeffrey Wright as Commissioner Gordon in The Batman. They thought he was good.
Yeah, he was great.
Though the source weirdly throws in a comment about the movie's box office, which feels a bit random. Lawrence Fishburne as Perry White in the Superman movies gets a nod as a good example. And Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury.
Right, but Nick Fury has comic book precedent for being black in the Ultimates line, doesn't he?
Exactly. And the source notes that context. So it seems like changes are viewed more positively by this source. If the actor is great, the character maybe isn't the main character, or if there's some wiggle room in the source material itself.
But they must have examples they didn't like.
Oh yeah, the tone definitely shifts. Michael Clark Duncan as Kingpin in the Daredevil movie. They say passable.
Ouch. Passable.
Yeah, and they contrast it unfavorably with Vincent D'Onofrio's later portrayal, and then they bring up death in Netflix's Sandman.
Kirby Howell-Baptiste, yeah, that got some discussion too.
It did, and the source suggests that casting might have played a role in why, in their view, the show didn't land quite as strongly as it could have. Again, that's their interpretation.
So they're connecting potential audience reaction or even show success directly to these casting choices.
Very directly. And they position the Snape situation as being most similar to that Sandman example, implying there's a real risk of turning off a chunk of the audience and maybe hurting the show's success. Which leads right into the next point, the potential impact on things like money and viewership.
Exactly. The source makes a pretty bold prediction here. They suggest this casting could dampen enthusiasm, hurt ratings, maybe even affect long-term earnings and merchandise sales.
Wow. That's a big claim.
It is. The argument is basically that a large part of the core Harry Potter fan base, the really dedicated ones, are likely to see this specific casting as, well, a mistake.
And this ties into the virtue signaling accusation they level at Warner Brothers.
Yes. The source questions why make this change. They argue the franchise is already massively successful, financially secure. So why risk alienating your base? They frame it as possibly being more about appearances than about serving the story or the existing audience.
It raises that tricky question about studio motivations versus fan expectations, doesn't it? Definitely. And then the discussion in the source material takes another turn, getting into potential thematic issues.
Thematic? How so?
Well, the source raises concerns about how a black snake might interact with the whole backstory involving James Potter being a bully.
The Marauders era stuff.
Right. They suggest it could unintentionally introduce a racial dynamic to that bullying that was never in the books.
Yeah.
And they even paint this picture now. This is purely hypothetical, not from the books of James Potter hangs a black Snape by his trousers under a tree.
Whoa. Okay, that's a stark image.
It's definitely jarring.
Right.
And the point the source seems to be making is that changing a character's race isn't always simple. It can ripple outward and create potentially uncomfortable or unintended subtext, especially when you're dealing with bullying and power dynamics.
That's a complex layer to consider, which probably brings us to the classic counter-argument. Come on, it doesn't matter, it's fiction.
The ultimate shrug off, yeah. How does the source handle that one?
With quite a bit of sarcasm, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The source responds by throwing out these deliberately absurd casting ideas. Like, what about casting the 42-year-old woman who apparently auditioned for Hermione?
Okay.
Or Jason Isaacs' Lucius Malfoy himself as Hermione. Or even John Lithgow as a trans Dumbledore, playing on one of his previous roles.
Right, so they're using reductio ad absurdum, basically.
Pretty much. To make the point that if fidelity really doesn't matter, why stop at race? Why not change age, gender, anything? They see the "it doesn't matter" argument as being applied selectively.
So the punchline is?
The final dig is basically, look, if it truly doesn't matter, then just keep Snape white. It's their way of saying they see inconsistency in how that argument is used.
It's certainly a provocative counter. Does the source offer any thoughts on who should play Snape or other characters? Any positive suggestions?
A couple, yeah. It's not all negative critique. They actually mention approving of the John Lithgow for Dumbledore idea, despite him being American. And then there's a slightly funny suggestion for Snape, Adam Driver, partly because, as the source notes, he has a very large nose.
Huh. Well, that is a notable Snape feature in the books.
It is. And they also briefly touch on the idea of makeup, kind of satirically suggesting you could just put white makeup, a fake nose, and a wig on Papa Essiedu.
Yeah.
It just, again, highlights how central that specific visual is for this commenter.
Right. Which really brings us back to the core conflict here, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The one this source material puts front and center.
Absolutely. It's this fundamental tension. On one side, you have the desire for that truly faithful adaptation, the one that honors all the details, the lore, the descriptions that made millions fall in love with the books.
And on the other side,
you have this move towards race-conscious casting. The source clearly sees it as prioritizing identity over authenticity, as they put it.
Yeah. And we've gone through their points. Yeah. The textual evidence about Snape's appearance, the arguments against that identity focus, the look at how other race swaps have landed.
Right, the mixed results there, according to the source. Plus the potential knock-on effects they predict: financial, audience reaction, even those thematic concerns they raised.
So after digging into all this commentary provided by our listener, it really leaves a big question hanging in the air for you, the listener.
Yeah. Thinking about these really strong reactions, the financial side of things, the arguments about lore and faithfulness, what do you think is ultimately more important when adapting characters everyone knows and loves?
Is it sticking rigidly to every detail from the page? Or is the goal of achieving broader representation on screen more important?
It's tough, right? There are clearly strong feelings on both sides. And thinking about the long-term impact on the story itself and on how audiences connect with these characters, it's definitely something worth pondering as we wait to see how this new series actually unfolds.